think one of the clearest signs that we're moving into a more authoritarian era in American history is that a growing share of Americans are showing by their actions that they are afraid of publicly politically disagreeing with Donald Trump and his administration. Now, of course, there have been in American history for long periods classes of Americans who had, for good reason, this fear of public political disagreement with their government. Black Americans, women before they had the vote. I mean, this is not something by any means which is unprecedented, but I think in recent decades, certainly, white Americans, white male Americans, have not felt generally afraid, except for maybe a small cadre of people on the far right you might associate with the militia movement or these kind of things. But most white Americans, or white male Americans in particular, have not feared that if they publicly disagreed with their government, there would be very dangerous consequences to them. And I think we are now entering into an era in which more and more people actually do. So, and you can see the signs almost every day. So, last week, for instance, the owner of the LA Times said that they were hiring a guy named Scott Jennings to join their editorial board. And he said, the owner of the LA Times, that it's because they need more ideological diversity. Now that's nonsense, right? You could have decided anytime over the last several years that you thought the LA Times needed more ideological diversity. This wasn't a desire for ideological diversity. It was a desire to appease the Trump administration for fear that the Trump administration may lash out at the LA Times and this guy's other business interests, perhaps, because the paper will be seen as adversarial. It's the same reason this billionaire also refused to allow his paper to endorse Kamala Harris in the election, just as Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, did the same thing. And by the way, the person they hired for this editorial position in the LA Times, I mean, there are serious, thoughtful conservatives who one could bring aboard, but this guy is basically just a pro-Trump pundit who doesn't really bring any intellectual credentials to the LA Times. So basically, what we're seeing is that billionaires are now so afraid of Donald Trump that they are curtailing what their newspapers are doing for fear of offending him, right? And that's not something that has been a feature of American political life in recent decades. And other Americans can draw the obvious conclusion, which is that if these billionaires who can hire the fanciest lawyers in the world have more protection than 99% of Americans, if they are afraid of crossing Donald Trump, what does it mean for the rest of us? You can also see, and I've just noticed this with people that I know, that since the election, there has been a kind of turning inward. And that's obviously partly just because people are depressed and disillusioned, like they would be after any election if their side didn't win. But I think there's something deeper going on. This was not a normal election. This is also a kind of response to authoritarianism, to a public square, which is just not dispiriting, but is actually more dangerous. So one of the books about authoritarianism that has had the most lasting effect on me is by the Polish writer Czesław Miłosz, his famous book called The Captive Mind. And he talks about how different individuals responded to the onset of Soviet totalitarianism in Poland. And he talks about something which he calls aesthetic hetman. And he describes it as um, it expressed itself in an unconscious longing for strangeness, which is channeled toward controlled amusements like theater, film, and folk festivals, but also into various forms of escapism. He details this escapism that basically various artists and writers and intellectuals went through because they couldn't. It was too frightening to be involved in public debate anymore as Poland became more and more repressive. So he talks about writers who burrowed into ancient texts and wrote children's books, and chose literary university careers that could allow them to study literary history, which offered a safe pretext for plunging into the past and for conversing with works of great aesthetic value. The number of translators of former prose and poetry multiplies. Painters seek an outlet for their interest in illustrations for children's books. He's describing essentially that era's version of now people turning off MSNBC or the New York Times and just watching cooking shows or watching the NFL, basically retreating from public life. And his point is not just that it's because it's dispiriting, but I think we're also seeing that there will be the real danger that people do that because they are afraid. just like Jeff Bezos and like the owner of the LA Times, are afraid of crossing Donald Trump because we really don't know what the repercussions will be. We know that his appointees, who are wildly kind of absurdly unqualified for their jobs, many of them have one key element in common, which is they're slavish devotees of Donald Trump, and they have shown publicly said, as he has said repeatedly, that they're willing to try to take retribution against Trump's critics. Most recently, Kash Patel, the the person that Trump has nominated to be the head of the FBI. So I think for most Americans who are not used to this situation, we have to think seriously about what we can learn from other societies and places where people have faced this fear of expressing themselves politically. And there's another book besides Milosh's that really has stuck with me. It's a more recent book. It's by the journalist Eyal Press, and it's called Beautiful Souls. And he looks at, in some ways, the opposite of what Milosh looks at. Milosh looks at how people comply. And then Eyal Press looks at the small minority of people who, in times of great political stress, do not comply. And he makes a number of points, one of which is that people who don't comply are people who are more willing to look the injustices that they see in the face. So he tells this story of a Swiss police captain who, when he was instructed, like all the other police captains, to shut down the border to Jews who were fleeing Nazism from Austria, that he let hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews in violation of the law and putting himself at grave risk. And one of the points that Eyal Press makes was that this man actually personally met the Jewish refugees who were trying to come across the border. A lot of the other police captains delegated that to their subordinates, so they never had to see the human consequences of what was being done by the state. But this man actually, because he saw these desperate Jews himself, it essentially brought out his sense of conscience and his courage and his willingness to act. A second point that Press makes is that people who act courageously in times of political repression are people who tend to believe in some ideal. It may be that they believe in a certain notion of the nation, or some religious principle, or some moral principle. The point is that they are not pure cynics, and this is a point that a lot of people have made about authoritarian and totalitarian governments. Is that the point is to create cynicism, to try to make you think that, yeah, sure, Trump is a crook. Sure, Trump only cares about himself. But, Joe Biden was the same way. Hillary Clinton was the same way. They're all the same way. Everyone lies. Everyone's in it for themselves. So there's no real principle at stake here when you're fighting against Donald Trump. And Press makes the point that people who stand up and show courage in the face of injustice and oppression are people who actually don't believe that, who do believe that there are principles at stake that some people are willing to fight for that have real value, that not everything is a lie, not everything is self-interested and corrupt. And the third point he makes is that people are more likely to act politically in courageous ways when they have a sense of community, when they don't feel totally alone, when other people tell them, you're not crazy for doing this. In some ways, when the other people can, with them, puncture this artificial lie that is created by people in power, and that people need that sense of doing that together. And I would just add one more thing, which is that I think that if people that one of the grave dangers of this moment is that people are more willing, I think, to acquiesce to Donald Trump if they have already been willing to acquiesce to certain political lies and political corruptions already, and they've gotten habituated to that. And so one of the things that I believe very strongly is that I don't trust people who have been willing to acquiesce and lie when it comes to what America has done in Gaza, to be reliable in standing up in the face of this authoritarian threat. It seems to me that there is a way in which people are conditioned to not speak the truth and not be willing to accept the consequences of that truth. And once you go down that road, it becomes easier to go further and further down that road. And I do think this is one of the dangerous consequences that we've seen over the last year, in particular in the Democratic Party, which is the party that we would expect would be the party that would be willing to stand up to Donald Trump, that there has been for years now, just as there's been a Republican Party, a kind of conspiracy of silence to not say publicly what people say privately about Donald Trump. In a somewhat different way, that dynamic has also existed in the Democratic Party when it comes to what Israel does to Palestinians. And so you can even have a person like Samantha Power. And Samantha Power is a very talented, very, very talented person. But here was Samantha Power, who wrote a book about genocide and even coined this word upstander. She said people shouldn't be bystanders, they should be upstanders. This was kind of her lesson that she was drawing from these terrible acts of genocide that she had chronicled. And yet she herself has stayed for 4 years as head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, as the United States has armed what more and more international legal scholars now call a genocide. So if you can do that, can we really trust that you're going to be an upstander when it comes to Donald Trump? These are muscles that need to be exercised. And I worry that they have atrophied in certain corners because of the political pressures that have long existed when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And that now those pressures will be even greater now that people are afraid of the retribution of a Trump presidency. And I hope that people can build those muscles to be willing to stand up in ways that Bezos and the owner of the LA Times have not. But the people who I trust the most to do that are the people who've already shown that they're willing to do that when it comes to U.S. policy towards Palestinians, because that has already been a kind of test, it seems to me, of courage. And it's the politicians like AOC, like a small number of other, like Bernie Sanders, who have passed that test that I think are the ones that I have the most faith in this new grave, grave test that I think we're about to face in a second Trump term.